محمد وآل محمد صلوات.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ياسين والقرآن الحكيم إنك لمن المرسلين على صراط مستقيم تنزيل العزيز الرحيم لتنذر قوما ما أنذر آباؤهم فهم غافلون لقد حق القول على أكثرهم فهم لا يؤمنون إنا جعلنا في أعناقهم أغلالا فهي إلى الأذقان فهم مقمحون وجعلنا من بين أيديهم سدا ومن خلفهم سدا فأغشيناهم فهم لا يبصرون وسواء عليهم أأنذرتهم أم لم تنذرهم لا يؤمنون إنما تنذر من اتبع الذكر وخشي الرحمن بالغيب فبشره بمغفرة وأجر كريم إن نحن نحيي الموتى ونكتب ما قدموا وآثارهم وكل شيء أحصيناه في إمام مبين واضرب لهم مثلا أصحاب القرية إذ جاءها المرسلون إذ أرسلنا إليهم اثنين فكذبوهما فعززنا بثالث فقالوا إنا إليكم مرسلون قالوا ما أنتم إلا بشر مثلنا وما أنزل الرحمن من شيء إن أنتم إلا تكذبون قالوا ربنا يعلم إنا إليكم لمرسلون وما علينا إلا البلاغ المبين قالوا إن تطيرنا بكم لئن لم تنتهوا لنرجمنكم وليمسنكم منا عذاب عليم قالوا طائركم معكم أئن ذكرتم بل أنتم قوم مسرفون وجاء من أقصى المدينة رجل يسعى قال يا قوم اتبعوا المرسلين اتبعوا من لا يسألكم أجرا وهم مهتدون وما لي لا أعبد الذي فطرني وإليه ترجعون أتخذ من دونه آلية إن يردني الرحمن بضر لا تغني عني شفاعتهم شيئا ولا ينقذون إني إذا لفي ضلال مبين إني آمنت بربكم فاسمعون قيل ادخل الجنة قال يا ليت قومي يعلمون بما غفر لي ربي واجعلني من المكرمين وما أنزلنا على قومه من بعده من جند من السماء وما كنا منزلين إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم خامدون يا حسرة على العباد ما يأتيهم من رسول إلا كانوا به يستهزئون ألم يروا كم أهلكنا قبلهم من القرون أنهم إليه لا يرجعون وإن كل لما جميع لدينا محضرون وآية لهم الأرض الميتة أحييناها وأخرجنا منها حبا فمنه يأكلون وجعلنا فيها جنات من نخيل وأعناب وفجرنا فيها من العيون ليأكلوا من ثمره وما عملته أيديهم أفلا يشكرون سبحان الذي خلق الأزواج كلها مما تنبت الأرض ومن أنفسهم ومما لا يعلمون وآية لهم الليل نسلخ منه النهار فإذا هم مظلمون والشمس تجري لمستقر لها ذلك تقدير العزيز العليم والقمر قدرناه منازل حتى أذاق الأرجون القديم لا الشمس ينبغي لها أن تدرك القمر والليل سابق النهار وكل في فلك يسبحون وآية لهم أن حملنا ذريتهم في الخلق المشحون وخلقنا لهم من مثله ما يركبون وإن نشأ نغرقهم فلا صريخ لهم ولا هم ينقذون إلا رحمة منا ومتاعا إلى حين وإذا قيل لهم اتقوا ما بين أيديكم وما خلفكم لعلكم ترحمون وما تأتيهم من آية من آيات ربهم إلا كانوا عنها معرضين وإذا قيل لهم أنفقوا مما رزقكم الله قال الذين كفروا للذين آمنوا أنطعم من لو يشاء الله أطعمه إن أنتم إلا في ضلال مبين ويقولون متى هذا الوعد إن كنتم صادقين ما ينظرون إلا صيحة واحدة تأخذهم وهم يخصمون فلا يستطيعون توصية ولا إلى أهلهم يرجعون ونفخ في السور فإذا هم من الأجداث إلى ربهم ينسلون قالوا يا ويلنا من بعثنا من مرقدنا هذا ما وعد الرحمن وصدق المرسلون إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم جميع لدينا محضرون فاليوم لا تظلم نفس شيئا ولا تجزون إلا ما كنتم تعملون إن أصحاب الجنة اليوم في شغل فاكهون هم وأزواجهم في ظلال على الأرائك متكئون لهم فيها فاكهة ولهم ما يدعون سلام قول من رب رحيم وامتاز اليوم أيها المجرمون ألم أعهد إليكم يا بني آدم ألا تعبدوا الشيطان إنه لكم عدو مبين وأن اعبدوني هذا صراط مستقيم ولقد أضل منكم جبلا كثيرا أفلم تكونوا تأكلون هذه جهنم التي كنتم توعدون اصلوها اليوم بما كنتم تكفرون اليوم نختم على أفواههم وتكلمنا أيديهم وتشهد أرجلهم بما كانوا يكسبون ولو نشاء لطمسنا على أعينهم فاستبقوا الصراط فأنى يبصرون ولو نشاء لمسكناهم على مكانتهم فما استطاعوا مضيا ولا يرجعون ومن نؤمره ننكسه في الخلق أفلا يأكلون وما علمناه الشعر وما ينبغي له إن هو إلا ذكر وقرآن مبين لينذر من كان حيا ويحق القول على كافرين أولم يروا أنا خلقنا لهم مما عملت أيدينا أنعاما فهم لها مالكون وذللناها لهم فمنها ركوبهم ومنها يأكلون ولهم فيها منافع ومشارب أفلا يشكرون واتخذوا من دون الله آلهة لعلهم ينصرون لا يستطيعون نصرهم وهم لهم جند محضرون فلا يحزنك قولهم إنا نعلم ما يسرون وما يعلنون أولم يرى الإنسان أنا خلقناه من نطفة فإذا هو خصيم مبين وضرب لنا مثلا ناسي خلقه قال من يحيي العظام وهي رميم قل يحييها الذي أنشأها أول مرة وهو بكل خلق عليم الذي جعل لكم من الشجر الأخضر نارا فإذا أنتم منه توقدون أوليس الذي خلق السماوات والأرض بقادر على أن يخلق مثلهم بلى وهو الخلاق العليم إنما أمره إذا أراد شيئا أن يقول له كن فيكون فسبحان الذي بيده ملكوت كل شيء وإليه ترجعون صدق الله العلي العظيم.
در محمد و آل محمد صلوات.
بانو یہ عابد کو بتلا رہی ہے میری سکینہ کو نیند آ رہی ہے بانو یہ عابد کو بتلا رہی ہے میری سکینہ کو نیند آ رہی ہے کہہ دو ہواؤں سے آہستہ آئیں کہہ دو پرندوں سے گل نہ مچائیں کہہ دو اندھیروں سے واپس نہ جائیں کہہ دو اندھیروں سے واپس نہ جائیں جاگی ہوئی چین کچھ پا رہی ہے میری سکینہ کو نیند آ رہی ہے، بانو یہ عابد کو بتلا رہی ہے، میری سکینہ کو نیند آ رہی ہے۔ شاید رسن کی اذیت ہوئی کم، مدم کرو بیویوں شور ماتم، سجاد زنجیر بولے نہ اس دم، سجاد زنجیر بولے نہ اس دم، شاید غموں کی گری جا رہی ہے، میری سکینہ کو نیند آ رہی ہے، بانو یہ عابد کو بتلا رہی ہے، میری سکینہ کو نیند آ رہی ہے۔ یہ شام غریباں کی جاگی ہوئی ہے، تماچوں کے در سے نہیں سو سکی ہے، ذرا اب گلے سے رسن جو کلی ہے، ذرا اب گلے سے رسن جو کلی ہے، سکون سے جو اب سانس لے پا رہی ہے، میری سکینہ کو نیند آ رہی ہے، بانو یہ عابد کو بتلا رہی ہے، میری سکینہ کو نیند آ رہی ہے۔ زندہ قدر زور سے اب نہ کولو، اے پہرے دارو اب آہستہ بولو، تم بھی تو جاگے ہو کچھ دیر سو لو، تم بھی تو جاگے ہو کچھ دیر سو لو، بابا کی خوشبو اسے آ رہی ہے، میری سکینہ کو نیند آ رہی ہے، بانو یہ عابد کو بتلا رہی ہے، میری سکینہ کو نیند آ رہی ہے، پر محمد و آل محمد صلوات۔
بر محمد و آل محمد صلوات۔ برائے خوشنودی امام زمانہ بلند تر صلوات اللہم صلی علی محمد و آل Muhammad. Sayyid Shabbir Kirmani, respected elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. SURA-E-FATEHA is requested for the Isal Sawab of Marhumeen listed on the screen and for all Marhumeen. Suratul Mubarakatul Fatiha. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. YUJIB is requested for the names listed on the screen and for all those in need here and elsewhere. YUJIB, let's recite 5 times. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. أَمَّن يُجِيبُ الْمُضْطَرَّ إِذَا دَعَاهُ وَيَكْشِفُ السُّوءَ 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 صلوات. Couple of announcements, inshallah. Jummah Niyaz Fund, due to the increase in attendance from the Jummah Salat, the Jummah Niyaz Fund is now open for additional sponsors who wish to contribute towards the Niyaz. Please contact Brother Murtaza Kareem at number on the screen to make a one-time or an ongoing sponsorship towards the Niyaz. Donations can also be made online or by placing cash or check in the boxes labeled Niyaz Fund located in the ladies and gents sides. We would like to express our gratitude to our current sponsor Bandai Khuda for their weekly contributions towards Jummah Niyaz. May Allah reward them and all those who contribute towards this fund. Let's have a loud salawat for all of them. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. At this time we would like to invite Sayyid Shabbir to come and recite tonight's majlis. Par Muhammad wa ali Muhammad salawat.
رحم الله من قرأ سورة المباركة الفاتحة. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. فوضوا أمري إلى الله إن الله بصير بالعباد ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. حسبنا الله ونعم الوكيل ونعم المولى ونعم النصير. والصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على الرسول المسدد المصطفى الأمجد المحمود الأحمد الذي سمي في السماء بأحمد وفي الأرض بأبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى أهل بيت الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين المنتجبين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا. اللهم صل على محمد. وقل رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. أما بعد، قال الله تبارك وتعالى في كتاب الكريم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم، إنما يخشى الله من عباده العلماء. صدق الله العلي العظيم. زينوا مجالسكم بالصلوات على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد. My respected elders, brothers and sisters in Iman here in Florida or across the globe, wherever you're hearing my voice, Salamun alaykum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Question: what does it mean to be truly educated? Keep that question in the back of your mind, inshallah, we will return to it. We're told there's a moment in time where Walid ibn Abdul Malik, Walid the first, who is in Syria, he's in Damascus, in Levant, he wants to come towards Yathrib or towards Medina to make a visit. He has given the order to his subordinate who is in Yathrib, who is ruling on his behalf in Medina by the name of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, also known as Umar II. According to this, he's told him that you are to look after the affairs and expand the mosque of Rasulullah. At that point in time, when he makes the move from Damascus towards Medina to visit and see the expansion happen, we're told when he gets there at a moment where the fifth Imam, Imam Baqir salawatullah wasalamu alayhi, is lecturing in Medina. When he sees the Imam lecturing there in Medina, he begins to hear the topic of conversation that the Imam is discussing. He asks and inquires, what is the topics that's being addressed here? What is the subject matter that's being addressed here? This is not Islam, this is not jurisprudence, this is not fiqh, this is not the Quran, this is something totally different that I am unaware of. He says, what is this? He asked someone nearby. And when he asked someone nearby, they gave the response to him, this is to do with the sciences of the earth, of the sun, of the stars, of the moon, and of the planets. What we in modern terms would call astronomy, for example, or physics, or some combination of the two. At that point in time, he became astonished. But as he's looking, Walid is looking through the crowd, he sees a small boy by the age of 3 years of age, according to the narration. When he sees this boy of 3 years of age, he inquires as to who is this individual, and is he capable of sitting here in this gathering, talking about something so intellectually advanced? At that point in time, the people responded, he is the most capable of everyone here. He says, who is this? This is Jafar ibn Muhammad, the son of the one who's sitting on the minbar. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. He says, this is the son of the person who's sitting on the minbar of Rasulullah. Imam Baqir, his son is a Sadiq, Jafar as-Sadiq. He is 3 years old and he's the one who is sitting in attendance. He says, he's 3 and able to comprehend these things. I've not even heard of this subject. And he's comprehending? He said, he's the most capable. He said, let me test him. This was something that they had an old custom of testing the knowledge of Ali Muhammad. At that point in time, he says, young man, may I speak to you? He says, very well. He says, can you tell me who is the founder of logic? Now, he had maybe some wazirs around him who gave him some questions or things that he had heard, so he asked him. Now, remember the time and the period of the Imam. It's after the time of Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen, Imam Hassan, Imam Hussein, Imam Zain al-Abidin, Imam Baqir's time. It's that period of time. And it's a movement between the Umayyad dynasty into the Abbasid dynasty. This is the period of Imam Sadiq. At that point in time, he says, who's the founder of logic? Now keep in mind, the Imam, we sometimes say the Imam only knows about the Quran and the Hadith. So hold on a moment. This man asks, who is the founder of logic? He says, the answer that you are looking for is Aristotle, Arastu. He was shocked. His 3-year-old boy knows the name of Aristotle? How? He says, he thought about it according to the riwayah. He then thought again and he said, what question can I ask him? What is it that he may not know? He says, who is Almaz? He says, the name that you've given is incomplete, Imam says to him. He says, what you're referring to is actually a constellation of stars. He was shocked. He was taken aback. He thought, I don't have any more questions. What should I ask him? He says, who is Al-Siwak? He asked the 3-year-old Imam. He says, Al-Siwak, the person you're referring to is the name of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, the companion of Rasulullah. He didn't even know the questions himself and he did not even know the answers. He asked the Imam. The Imam answered him at that age. The individual that you and I have come to commemorate tonight, Imam Jafar ibn Muhammad as-Sadiq alayhi salam, is that individual who we take our namesake from. We are spending our lives in the zikr of Rasulullah, in the zikr of Islam, in the zikr of Amir al-Mu'mineen. We are spending our lives in the zikr of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. But when we are known by other Muslims in this world, the first name that comes forward is Ja'far as-Sadiq. That we are Ja'fari by madhab, in terms of our school of thought. Who was this individual? Who was this personality? And what gems of guidance does this great Imam give you and I? Not 100 years ago, not 200 years ago, not 1400 years ago, but today in this era, in this time. There are so many aspects of the dimensions of the Imam's life. What do we take on board? Before we begin this analysis and discussing what is the University of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam and what is the modern education system and how do they reconcile between the two and what it truly means to be educated, the question I asked at the beginning, we must first understand one principle, and that principle is this. There is a riwayah from the Ahlul Bayt that says, with respect to the Ahlul Bayt, whether it's the first Imam or the 12th Imam or the 6th Imam or any of the Imams, in the three elements they are identical, there's no difference. What are they? Number one, in their shuja'ah, in their courage, there's no difference between them. They are the bravest of the brave. The bravery of Ali ibn Abi Talib is the bravery of Al-Mahdi, is the bravery of Al-Sadiq, is the bravery of Al-Baqir. The bravery is the same amongst all of them. What else? Number two, their ibadah, their worship is identical. The worship of Ali ibn Abi Talib is the worship of Zainul Abidin. And the worship of Zainul Abidin is the worship of Ali ibn Abi Talib. And number three, knowledge. They are all kulluna Muhammad in all three of these aspects, especially knowledge. So when we highlight the knowledge of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, we are not highlighting that he's just knowledgeable and he's not shuja and he's not, God forbid, an abid of Allah. He is at the height of ubudiyah and he's at the height of courage as well, and we'll see that in a moment. But when we understand the environment in which the Ahlul Bayt existed, then we understand what are the elements that were able to be amplified during the times of certain Imams. And that's the first thing that we need to highlight, number one. Number two, the second element that I want to look at is what is the modern education system? What is the system that our youth, our youngsters go to? Whether it's K through 12, whether it's public schools, whether it's private schools, whether it's universities, what are the different types of universities? And what is the methodology of schooling that is given? And what's the background behind that? Because if you and I do not understand the methodology of the curricula that is taught in the schools, we don't understand what is the worldview of people living here, of our own youth, of our own community members, of ourselves. It's vital to understand where did that perspective come from. Number two. Number three, what is the University of Imam Sadiq? What was the view of Imam Sadiq? What was Imam Sadiq alayhi salam teaching? Was he teaching only Quran? Was he only teaching Hadith? Was he only teaching fiqh? Or was he teaching other sciences? And if he was teaching other sciences, what are those sciences? Number four, when we study the University of Imam Sadiq and the Ahadith of Imam Sadiq, do we understand a methodology of the Ahlul Bayt in terms of what it means to be truly educated? And if so, what is it meant by being truly educated as per the Ahlul Bayt? Not per modern education systems. And finally, we will conclude with the epic tragedy of the Imam alayhi salam. The sacrifice that the Imam made for you and I, it cannot be overstated and underestimated. That is something that we must understand. These are the 5 things that we'll be looking at tonight. Wherever you are, here in Florida or across the globe, wherever you're hearing my voice, from the bottom of your heart, send a salawat on Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala. At the first level, when we look at the life of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, I already mentioned the example of where at a very young age he was exemplifying his knowledge, number one. Number two, it is very well known that the Imam alayhi salam, in terms of his knowledge, he was well versed in numerous languages. For example, he was a master in the Nabatean language. Now, you may say, what is this language and who are these people? These are a people who are Arabic or Aramaic. They were part of those people who are Syriac. You see, whether it's those people who speak Hebrew or those people who speak Arabic or the people who speak Nabatean, they are people who are from a common geography. These are people who are generally in northern Arabia. For example, in Jordan, modern day Jordan or modern day Palestine, they had a different way of speaking. The Imam was fluent in this, and there are numerous riwayat where someone came from that region and spoke in that language, and Imam spoke with him fluently. Documented. Number one. Number two, what other language was the Imam fluent in? The Imam was also fluent in Hebrew. It's documented according to the hadith. For example, there was a scenario where a group of people asked, Yabna Rasulillah, what do the Jews say when they are, for example, slaughtering their animals, kosher, for example, meat? When they are doing that, what are they saying? The Imam told them in the Hebrew language, he translated and explained to them what it is that they are saying, for example. So the Imam has documented on numerous occasions using the Hebrew language, number one. Number two. Number three, the Imam has documented using the Farsi language. Imam is in Medina, he's not in Persia. He's speaking Farsi with those people who are coming from modern day Iran or Persia and speaking to them. There's another moment where the Imam comes and there's a gathering of at least people of at least 15 different languages, and the Imam speaks to each and every one of them in their own language. The person, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. The companion of the Imam, he says, Yabna Rasulullah, you speak this many languages? He says, oh my dear Shia, we are the Imams of all. We speak all of the languages. These are just the ones that you've witnessed before you. So the Imam had absolute mastery in this regard, number one. The next element of the equation that I wanted to share with you, the Imam alayhi salam, he told his Shia, do not just relegate memorizing and keeping things in your heart, write them down, because this will help you down the road. Why? You know, at the time, after Rasulullah, there were different generations according to Muslims. There's Rasulullah, then after him there's the generation of those people who are Sahaba, who are with Rasulullah, contemporaries of Rasulullah. Then after the Sahaba, those are Tabi'i. Tabi'i are those people who did not see Rasulullah, but they saw someone who saw Rasulullah. Then after Tabi'i, there's Tabi'i. Tabi'i is someone who did not see Rasulullah, they did not see a Sahabi, but they saw a Tabi'i. And then it continued to Tabi'i. These were the generations of Muslims, and many times they would hear a verse of the Quran, they would memorize it in their heart, or they heard a hadith, they would memorize it in their heart. Imam Sadiq said, make sure you endeavor to write them down, write down the hadiths. Don't just keep them in your heart. Why? Because this will help you down the road. Do you know what happened? Today, we have 4 books of our books that are called Qutb Arba, the 4 books of Shia Hadith. Al-Kafi, Man La Yahdharu Al-Faqih, Tahzeeb and Istibsar. These are the 4 books of Shia Hadith. Do you know, this is called Qutb Arba'a. We used to have Qutb Arba Mi'a. We used to have 400 books of Hadith. If you know the history of Islam, you will know the Mongols invaded Baghdad and they burnt down the libraries. You know the history that's happened in the history of Muslims in terms of the travesty that's happened with respect to knowledge? Do you know the library of Alexandria, Iskandariya in Egypt, modern day Egypt? The Muslims conquered Egypt. They have the greatest library in the world, which was called the Library of Alexandria. The second Khalifa is ruling over the Muslim world. They asked him, what should we do with this library? Do you know what he said? He said that everything is the Quran. If these books have something against the Quran, they have no value. And if these books have something that is already in the Quran, we already have the Quran, you don't need anything else, so burn the whole library. These are the people who are ruling? Who had a sort of animosity towards knowledge? And then we ask, why is the Muslim world not ahead? Just because of rulers like this, and people who allowed them to rule and followed in those footsteps. Nonetheless, when this happened, over time, what we noticed was an environment where people, at some level, there was knowledge among certain people. But it didn't trickle down to the masses. And that's going to be a theme that you and I need to remember. With respect to Imam Sadiq, he said, write them down because the library will be burnt. And we lost many books. Many people didn't listen to what Imam Sadiq alayhi salam said. But I want to come now to the next level in the interest of time, which is the history of the modern educational system and where did it come from. In order to understand this, you will need to go back at least till the 1300s, if not earlier. But the 1300s is a moment where we can clearly define. What is that moment? That is what's called the start of the Renaissance. The Renaissance was a period in Europe, in particular in Italy, that took place from the 1300s, 1400s, 1500s, up until the 1600s, where it ended. The Renaissance was a period where there was a lot of flourishing in terms of the arts, for example, and culture. And during this period, there were certain families, such as the Medici families, who used to patronize Michelangelo and many other artists. The goal was this: to use art, to use culture in order to spread philosophy in the masses. So for example, a wealthy businessman would pay a big sum of money to an artist, they would make a mural, and that mural would try to explain a philosophy. For example, today you go to Florence in Italy, you will see a statue of David, who we would call Dawood. David, and this sculpture has been done. What is the symbolism behind it? The symbolism is this idea of someone who is less able versus someone who is more able. David and Goliath, who the Quran also alludes to. David and Goliath, this match, that the people of Florence have the ability, even if a mighty conqueror comes from outside, they are still able to hold their ground the same way that David held his ground in the Bible. This is the philosophy behind it. But they paid a lot of sum in order to create this artwork. By the way, I don't know if you know the history. The reason that Italy was able to flourish in the Renaissance was because of its business relationships with the Ottoman Empire, Turkey. If they didn't have those business relations with the Ottomans, they would not be able to flourish because their income came from there. The idea being that there was this flourishing. But here's the key point. The key point is, in the Renaissance, there was a movement of intellectualism, but it did not trickle down to the masses. It did not get down to the ground floor. It just stayed with the elite and the wealthy. After the Renaissance, or in parallel with the Renaissance, the next step was the scientific revolution. Please bear with me, because this is extremely important to understand in order to understand how do we think and see the world, and how does that compare and contrast with what Islam and the Ahlul Bayt wanted us to see. In the scientific revolution, you had, for example, in 1543, Copernicus, he puts out his works. And he says, look, it's not a heliocentric model of the world. It's not a geocentric model of the world. It's a heliocentric model of the world. The model that the church wanted and said was that it's geocentric, meaning the earth is the center of the universe. Everything gravitates around the earth. Copernicus comes forward and says, no, that's not the deal. The deal is the sun is at the center and everything rotates around the sun. And there's good evidence to suggest that he was building on the works of Nasiruddin al-Tusi, or Ayatollah Nasiruddin al-Tusi, who was one of the greatest scholars of Shia Islam, as well as one of the great scientists of the time. I don't have the time to discuss, but look at the Tusi couple. And if you look at the diagram that Nasiruddin al-Tusi made for the Tusi couple, and you look at the model of Copernicus, they look identical. The only difference is that where Nasiruddin al-Tusi has used alif, ba, ta, Arabic letters, Copernicus used English or Latin letters. Why is that important? Because Nasiruddin al-Tusi came before Copernicus. The point that I'm getting at is understand history and then you'll understand the picture more clearly. After the scientific revolution, and in the scientific revolution is also Newton, who you can never forget. Newton and his laws of the motion of society, of moving bodies, is still taught in universities in physics till this day. And it is something that has stood the test of time. These elements of thinking were then enlightened and led to the movement called Enlightenment. Renaissance, scientific revolution, Enlightenment. When the Enlightenment period arose, it was a movement where now what was happening in the Renaissance and the scientific revolution began to start trickle down into the general populace. When it began to trickle down into the general populace, people came forward and said, look, it's not all kings and rulers, no. The person on the ground floor also has a right. The person who's the middle class has a right. There needs to be rights that every individual has, regardless of what environment they come from. This was all part of the Enlightenment period. And part of the concept of the Enlightenment was that you and I should be enlightened in a way where we learn sciences and arts and we are free people. Then after Enlightenment came a period called Industrial Age, or the Industrial Age, or Industrialization. After Industrialization came Modernity. After Modernity came Post-Modernity. Now here's the real kicker. In that period in time of Enlightenment, till this day, many people, some of you here may have gone to, or other people, many wealthy people especially, send their children to liberal arts colleges. For example, which ones? For example, Dartmouth College. For example, Davidson College. For example, locally, Rollins College. Do you know what the concept of liberal arts is? Why are liberal arts? What does that term mean? Why a liberal arts college? Why do people spend these hefty fees to send their children to these universities? Sometimes $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a year. The idea of a liberal arts education is an education that liberates your mind, meaning frees your mind from the shackles of slavery. Why was that necessary? That if you teach these certain skills, for example, rhetoric, for example, grammar, for example, arts, mathematics, trigonometry, and the likes, you free and open up the mind. Why was that necessary? Because in liberal arts, they say the technology is going to change. The environment's going to change. But the idea is to give you the skills and the tools that you need in order to think more clearly. And so you can make decisions in any environment. But that's not the only thing. The other element is ethics. Are you compassionate to other citizens? Number 3, do you appreciate beauty and art? Do you appreciate those things? These are enlightenment concepts. What came after enlightenment? What is the term I just used? The industrial age, the industrial revolution. This is where the education system that many of us have gone through began to change. It moved from liberal arts or freeing the mind to professional, vocational, and technical education. What does that mean? Education to get a job. That's not bad in and of itself. That's not bad necessarily in and of itself. Please be very careful to listen to what I'm saying here. That's not necessarily bad in and of itself. But whereas the concept of enlightenment was to free the mind, open the mind, and your job and career is one aspect of your life, in modern education, our whole focus has become our career. And education of other sorts has fallen by the wayside. So I study accounting, which is good. I study finance, which is good. I study economics, which is good. But I may not study much about ethics, about culture, about art, about what are those things that free my mind from the shackles of slavery. If I understood those elements of the equation, perhaps my life would be different. You see, some of the most successful people of our world, the education that they give their children is very different than the education that you and I go through in a general public education, or even private education for that matter. Do you and I read books? If you don't have a love for books, as per the Ahlul Bayt, let alone Western sciences and other sciences, you are an orphan. We somehow think you finish high school, you finish college, that's when education ends. Can you imagine for a moment that you go to the doctors and the doctor says you're out of shape, you need to get back into shape. Oh doctor, no, I worked out in college, I worked out when I was younger. No, it doesn't work that way. You have to continuously eat right and exercise. No, I did that when I was 20. I did that when I was 18. But somehow we do the same thing when we talk about education. Oh, I learned what I needed to learn in school. I learned what I needed to learn in college. This is one paradigm of how we govern. I'm talking about the methodology of how we run our societies. Now come to this institution at the 3rd level of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. What was the institution of Imam Sadiq? What was the view of Imam Sadiq? The first thing that you need to understand, building on what I just said, is the institution of Imam Sadiq was built on the institution of Imam Ali alayhi salam in Kufa. The institution of Imam Ali, who used to give dars in Kufa, and he used to talk about not only jurisprudence, not only fiqh, he also used to talk about political science, he used to talk about economics, he used to talk about management, he used to talk about all of these different sciences and arts. And Imam Sadiq alayhi salam built on that foundation to expand it to talk about not only jurisprudence but physics, mathematics, physics, astronomy, chemistry, medicine, botany, and a whole slew of different sciences. We talk about Jafar ibn Hayyan, who is the founder of, we often say chemistry, but the appropriate term is alchemy. Alchemy was a science or an art science that many people focused on in that time. In fact, even Newton, who I mentioned a few moments ago, even Newton wrote extensively on alchemy. We may laugh at alchemy today, but at that time, alchemy was a big deal. Alchemy was the ability to change metals or other substances into gold. But that became the precursor in parallel with chemistry. So many of the things that were found in alchemy became the foundation for chemistry. But Jafar ibn Hayyan is definitely there. The other scholars of fiqh were also students of the Imam. But the Imam was not limited. And here's the lesson that you and I need to derive from this as I'm racing the clock. The Imam was not someone who just talked about Islam. He answered issues of science as well. Now, the critical question that comes from a community building standpoint is, are we producing scholarship globally? I always speak globally. Are we producing scholarship that is anywhere near the caliber of the Imams? Yes, you may say the Imams are too high. I agree with you. The Imams are too high. But are we producing anyone close to the students of the Imam, who are experts not only in Islam but other sciences? Because if we aren't, we are going to be susceptible to losing many of our next generation. Why? Because they will not have their their questions answered to their satisfaction. What do I mean? Sallu ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma sallam. I realize this is dense, but this is very important for the future of our community. Please bear with me. There's a moment in time where a man comes to the ruler of the time. He says, I have a question. He says, what's the question? He says, this universe, this world of ours, if you go beyond the sky or in our sky, there's 7 layers. It's like an onion. And these 7 layers are one after the other enveloped like an onion. I said, okay. He said, the question that I have is that when Rasulullah went for Mi'raj, how did he pierce through all of the different layers of the heavens? And after he went through all the layers and they broke, how did they come back together? He's saying, look, the universe, the earth, it has layers, 7 layers. And each of them is like layers of an onion. He says when Rasulullah went for Mi'raj, he went towards the heavens. He pierced through all of those layers, 7 layers. Who closed them after they were pierced? He began to ask his wazirs. They were the big scholars of Islam during the time of the 6th Imam. The big scholars. They said, well, they began to think, maybe it's this, maybe it's that. They couldn't come to a reconciliation. You know, one of them came forward and said, the final one, the biggest of them, he came forward and said, well, actually, Mi'raj was not physical, it was spiritual. That's where that mindset came from. That's where that thought came from, that Mi'raj was not physical, it was spiritual, because they couldn't answer that question. He said, no, that's not the answer. You're playing with me. He was a smart man. He said, you're playing with me. I'm telling you the circumstance, you tell me what happened. They said, we don't have an answer. He said, who has the answer? The ruler said. He said, there's one person from the line of Rasulullah. His name is Jafar, the son of Muhammad, As-Sadiq. He's the only one who can answer this. He's the only one who can answer this. He says, very well. Call him. When they called the Imam alayhi salam, he says at that point in time, the first question they asked the Imam, he says, do you believe that the ascension of Rasulullah on Mi'raj, was it physical or was it spiritual? By the way, on a side note, nobody asked about Adam. Adam also descended. They didn't ask that question. They asked about Rasulullah. Nonetheless, he says, we believe that Rasulullah went physically for Mi'raj. He said, very well. So now he's established, so he can't go anywhere. You know, physics, sometimes people move the goalposts in debates. He says, no, you can't move anywhere. He says, there are 7 layers. I'm a scientist. I know that there are 7 layers. Now, today we use terms like the stratosphere, the atmosphere, and the 7 layers. At that time, it was novel. It was new. He says there's 7 layers. Each is enveloped like an onion. When Rasulullah went for Mi'raj, he pierced through these layers. Who closed them? What happened? Now look, the Imams had a principle. They would answer people according to their ability and their intellect. And also the Imam is not using quantum mechanics terminology or physics terminology or astronomy terminology that we would use today. He's not using those terms of stratosphere and atmosphere and the likes. And he's not using, for example, acceleration and G-forces and things of this nature. He has to explain to someone 1400 years ago or 1300 years ago what is the science of the matter in a way that he'll understand and get it. He says, oh man, have you ever gone on a boat? I said, yes, plenty of times I've gone on the sea. He said, have you gone on the seas and have you ever been on a boat sailing in the seas? He says, yes. He said, have you ever gone at good speeds? I said, yes, I've gone on good speeds. He says, do you not see that when you are traveling in the water, in front of you, the vessel, the boat, it is ripping through the currents, and behind it the currents are closing? Have you not seen this? He became astonished. He said, I never thought of that. He said, I'll give you another example. Have you not been racing on horses in the desert? Because it was Arabia. He said, yes. He said, you've gone on high speeds? He said, yes. Do you not feel that you are bursting through the wind, and in front of you the wind is separating and behind you it's joining again? He said, I never thought of that. He says, the same way that the water rips open and closes behind you, the same way that the wind rips open and closes behind you, that's the same way that the heavens ripped open and closed behind Rasulullah. Allahumma salli ala. No one could answer that except the Imam alayhi salam. This is the intellect of the Imam, which was in all of the Imams, by the way. But the other Imams were in a circumstance where they could not make their knowledge apparent. This Imam did. And he answered people to their satisfaction. No one went away saying, I'm not satisfied with my answer. Now comes the issue of the methodology. There were 400, what we would call today, departments in the University of the Imam in Medina. And there were at least 4,000 students who came from far places such as Kufa and Basra and throughout Hijaz and many other regions. In fact, tribes would send and say, go to the University of Imam Sadiq. By the way, most of the students were not Shia. The vast majority were non-Shia students in the University of the Imam. In fact, there was a satellite campus, if you and I would call it, a regional campus in Kufa. 900 students used to study in the University of Kufa. All of them were saying, Qala as-Sadiq. They were all students of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. This was the level of the expanse of the knowledge of the Imam alayhi salam. But he's not only teaching Islamic sciences, he's talking about mathematics, physics, and all of those other things that you and I talk about. But not only that, remember, the Imams are reflections of divine attributes. One of the names of Allah is Al-Musawwir, or what we would call the artist. Amir al-Mu'mineen, do you know Imam Ali alayhi salam is the one who established the Kufic script of calligraphy? The Kufic script of writing was established by Imam Ali, created it. So the Imams were those who know Islam, they knew the sciences, hard and soft as you would call it, or natural and physical, for example. And they also knew the arts and they taught them. For example, the 5th Imam and the 6th Imam also taught poetry or the principles of poetry to many poets who didn't know them. And he would explain to them what are the elements of meter, what are the rhyming dynamics of poetry. The Imams taught all of these things. Now, comes to the principle. The Imams teaching all these different departments. And this university is flourishing. And the tyrants are shaking. Because they never wanted knowledge to be accessible to the people. Because what happens when knowledge is accessible to people? Their power begins to decline. They're not able to rule over people. By the way, one system in modern education systems, not my words, according to experts, is indoctrination. So one of the principles of modern education is to just absorb everything and just let it continue as it is. That is, if the government or the society is doing something that's wrong, the system does not necessarily teach you to speak out. This is a big difference than how it was supposed to be as per the Enlightenment. Now compare that to the time of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. In Imam Sadiq's time, and I'm racing the clock here again, there's a moment in time where there's a very famous hadith that every Shia should have written on their walls. It is the hadith of Unwan al-Basri. It's a very long hadith. I will condense just the crux of it, a very concentrated dose of it. Unwan al-Basri, Allama Qadi Tabatabai, who was the teacher of Allama Tabatabai, as well as Ayatollah Bahjat and many other scholars, he would not teach ilm al-akhlaq until you had read this hadith. Now, is this hadith, what is the authenticity, who is the Ravi? Leave that on the side for a moment. We'll discuss that another time. But Shahid al-Awwal has narrated this and it's in Bihar. But I'll leave that for another time. We can have a longer discussion on that. Understand this. Unwan was 94 years old. He comes to the Imam to learn. Imam says, I don't have time, I'm very busy. 94, he goes back. He was a student of Imam Malik. At that point in time, when Unwan, he finally does a dua and he prays to Allah, Ya Allah, open the heart of Jafar Sadiq to me. Now, why did the Imam tell him to go away in the beginning? Because he's saying knowledge takes commitment. Unwan gives us another lesson. Even though he's 94, he's still learning. Are you and I still learning at our ages? He comes to the Imam. Imam says, what do you want to learn, Unwan? He says, I want to learn knowledge. First principle from the University of the Imam. He says, knowledge is not simply reading and learning. Knowledge is a light that Allah illuminates in your heart. A paradigm shift in how you look at things. Yes, reading is important. Yes, learning is important. But ultimate knowledge comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's a light that He illuminates in your heart. He says, what do you want? What do you want? He says, I want a nasiha from you. The Imam gives him a nasiha. What does he say? In 3 domains. He says, I will tell you 9 things in 3 areas, 3 each. The Imam says to Unwan, what? Self-development, self-control, number 1. Number 2, dealing with others and patience with others. Number 3, knowledge itself. A principle that comes forward. In our modern world, the education system is designed in a manner that it only focuses on the latter. Do we teach people about how to develop consciousness of yourself? Do we teach people, for example, how to deal with others in a practical, pragmatic way? Do we teach people about ilm al-akhlaq? Oftentimes we don't. The Imam is starting by saying, number 1, you need to understand the principles. In the hadith of Unwan al-Basri, he says, number 1, self-control. He says, what is the first element of the equation? He says, do not eat unless you are hungry, number 1. The Imam says, Unwan, don't eat anything unless you're hungry. Yabna Rasulullah, why are you telling me this? I asked you for guidance on how to become knowledgeable. The Imam saying it's not disconnected. You know, one of the rulers of Banu Umayyah, his name was Sulaiman. Sulaiman was someone, you know, Harun Rashid, he got all of the clothes. Harun Rashid was Abbasid. We don't believe it's Rashid, of course. Rashid means rightly guided. Harun al-Abbasi. Harun al-Abbasi, after the Abbasids conquered the Umayyads, he got all of the clothes of all of the Umayyad rulers. When he saw Sulaiman's clothes, he says, why is there fat on his sleeves? And I've tried to wash it and it doesn't come off. He said, Sulaiman used to eat so much that he would not even wait. As soon as he got up in the morning, he wouldn't wait for the food to cool down. He would put it in his sleeves and he would eat it in a way that it would be embedded in his clothes. Imam says, first thing, don't eat unless you're hungry. Number 1. He said, number 2, make sure you don't eat unless it's halal. You know, Walid, who came after Sulaiman, Walid ibn Yazid, Walid the second. Do you know Walid? He had a pool in which it was made of alcohol. And he wouldn't get out of it until he drank fully from that pool. He would swim in it. Imam said, don't touch anything unless it's halal. Number 3, don't eat unless you say Bismillah. Imam, I asked for guidance on self-control. You're giving me guidance on self-control. You're saying what you eat, it's not disconnected. You see, when you understand the paradigm of the methodology of Imam Sadiq and of the Ahlul Bayt, whether I'm at school, whether I'm at work, whether I'm in the mosque, it's all the same. If I deal with people with ethics and akhlaq and morality, here, I should do the same at school, I should do the same in work. There's no difference. Imam's teaching him self-discipline through his eating habits, his dietary habits. Do we teach this in schools and universities? We don't oftentimes. The Imam's saying knowledge needs to be holistic. What else does he say? I'm racing the clock. He continues, then it is forbearance and dealing with others. So what happens? If someone says to you that if you say one bad thing to me, I will say 10 bad things back to you, you respond by saying, if you say 10 bad things to me, I will not even say one bad thing to you. This is what the Imam's teaching. The forbearance, the control of the nafs. He goes on further. The Imam alayhi salam says, if anyone slanders you and they say something against you, and it's not true, you say that if what you say is true, may Allah forgive me. And if what you say is not true, may Allah forgive you. And then he says, at the third level, he says, if someone said something bad to you, do not leave them except that you give them good words and good advice. You see, if we understood the principles of what the Imam is outlining, we wouldn't have the issues that we have in our communities today. I'm talking globally. If someone comes to me and treats me in this way, how am I dealing with him? Remember what happened to Malik al-Ashtar. Malik is the commander-in-chief of Amir al-Mu'mineen, the second strongest person after Amir al-Mu'mineen. A young man begins to pull at his clothes, and he pulls off his qaba from his shoulders. At that point in time, when he pulls this off, they said, "Do you know who this person is?" He's the strongest person in town after Amir al-Mu'mineen. He began to become very worried. He followed him. He noticed Malik went to the masjid. When he went to the masjid, he's waiting, he's praying, Malik's praying. He goes to him. He says, "I didn't know who you were. I didn't know your power. I didn't know your position." Malik says, "I did not come to the mosque except to pray for 2 rakah salah to Allah to forgive you." That's power. Forgiving someone when you have power. Not forgiving someone just when you have no power. Anyone can do that. But when you're in a position of power to forgive like Malik did, that's true akhlaq of Ahlul Bayt. Our issues arise because we have not understood the system of the Imam. We are still operating with the education system of the modern world and the modern society, which means oftentimes might is right. That's not the principle of the Ahlul Bayt. He goes on further. He says knowledge, the third level, knowledge. He says with respect to knowledge, make sure that you ask the scholars the questions. Ask them and get answers from them. But don't ask them to test their knowledge. Many times people come, they ask questions, they know the answer, they ask to test the knowledge. He says, don't ask to test their knowledge. Ask them sincerely to understand, to learn from them. He says, number 2, don't do your opinion. Don't put your opinion in matters. Don't do qiyas. The very famous debate of Imam Sadiq with Abu Hanifa, where Abu Hanifa was doing qiyas, analytical deduction. He said, how do you make your decisions? Imam Sadiq says to Abu Hanifa. Abu Hanifa says, through the Quran. Then what? Hadith. Then what? Qiyas. We don't believe in qiyas. Other Muslims do. In fiqh. He says, what do you do? He says, I do analytical deduction. He says, okay, very well. What is worse? For example, killing someone or adultery? He says, killing someone. Of course, that's worse. He says, then why does Allah require for murder 2 witnesses and for adultery 4 witnesses? The Imam is not saying that adultery or for example, killing someone, which is worse. He's highlighting what is the problem in your methodology. If you go by the methodology that you're saying, then that means that the adultery is worse than killing. The Imam is not saying which one is worse. He's saying, look at your methodology and the cracks that are in your methodology. So he says, number 2, in the hadith of Anwan al-Basri, don't use your opinion. He says, number 3, don't make your neck a bridge on people to go on in terms of fatwas. Don't give fatwas unless you absolutely have to. The Imam gives this guidance. What's the take-home message for you and I? With respect to our knowledge, as per the University of Imam Sadiq, if we understood his principles, we would not have issues in our families, we would not have issues in our communities. Because knowledge, in our modern world, many times knowledge is just memorizing and passing an exam. As a very famous MIT professor once said, when he was asked, what will we cover this semester in our class? He said, the question is not what will we cover. The question is what will you discover? Where is your critical thinking? This is what the Imams were highlighting. Can you think on your own? Do you have the tools to think on your own? Do you have the consciousness level? I tell you, if we understood the ego in philosophy and the ego in psychology, many of the issues that we have in our communities would not exist. But we don't go to that level. Why? Why are our systems not there in that place? Another time, there's so much to say. But who's the first teacher? The first teacher that a human being has is the parents, and in particular the mother. Tonight we're commemorating a mother in the Isal al-Sawab. But I want to share a moment in time. In the riwayat it's found that there was a moment where there was a plague in Yathrib, in Medina, where Imam Sadiq was. The mother of Imam Sadiq, Farwa, found out there was a plague. Some scholars say it was smallpox. We're not entirely sure. But it was affecting children especially. Bibi Farwa, the mother of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, she said, I will take my son outside of Yathrib, outside of the city, and I will look after him myself. It was a big sacrifice. She took her son, Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, to the outskirts of town. When she took him to this small village, the riwayah says that she didn't realize that she was taking care of her child so much that in that process, she gained the early stages of the illness itself, whether it was smallpox or the plague. But the symptoms were not apparent. After some time, the symptoms became apparent. By the way, smallpox often doesn't affect elders as much, but in rare cases, it may affect, it may affect and it may cause certain problems. Whatever the disease was, she began to then see the symptoms. She sent Imam Sadiq away in the same village, away to be looked after by someone else, and she was alone, suffering. The news reached Imam Baqir alayhi salam. When the news reached Imam Baqir alayhi salam, he stopped his lectures, he went towards the village to meet his wife. But before that he stopped and he went to the grave of Rasulullah. He said, Ya Rasulullah, oh my grandfather, my wife, she sacrificed for my son, for the Imam after me, to protect him. Protect her, by your sake. He made this dua and he went towards the village. When Imam Baqir alayhi salam got to the village, according to the riwayah, he said, my dear wife, how are you? She was so delighted to see Imam Baqir alayhi salam. At that point in time, he saw the symptoms that she was suffering. He said, worry not, my dear wife. Before I came here, I went to the grave of Rasulullah and I prayed for you there. And I know with the certainty in my heart that the dua that I have made to my grandfather, to Allah, through my grandfather has been accepted. And inshallah you'll be cured from this. And I have been immune to this. According to the riwayah, Bibi Farwa, she became very happy and she progressed and she survived. What is the point that I'm highlighting here? The first teacher of a child is the mother. And the sacrifice that the mother gives for a child is second to none. And this goes doubly so for our imams. Sheikh Murtaza al-Ansari is one of our greatest scholars of the last 150 years. They came to his mother and they said, congratulations on having Sheikh al-Akbar, or the great Sheikh, as your son. She said, you didn't ask me and you didn't congratulate him that he had a mother like me. They were astonished. What do you mean? Do you know that I would never feed him without doing wudu? Did you know that I would never be with him except that I would recite to Quran to him in the womb? It is not that he came out of nowhere, but it was the efforts of these mothers that made it happen. Allahu Akbar. Ajrukum Allah. At the final moments. There's a moment in time we are told where Imam As-Sadiq alayhi salam receives news. What news does he receive? That there was a lady who was the follower of the Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam. And when she is a follower of the Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam, she, in a moment, she falls in the bazaar. When she falls in the bazaar in the city, she harms and she injures her rib. When she harms and she injures her rib, she calls out right away at that moment. She says, and she calls out to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And she says, may Allah not have mercy on the killers of Fatima az-Zahra, because her rib was injured. When they heard this, they arrested her and they took her away. The news reached Imam Jafar as-Sadiq alayhi salam. Imam as-Sadiq, according to the riwayah, he goes to Masjid as-Sahla. When he goes to Masjid as-Sahla, he recites 2 rak'ah salah and he prays to Allah to alleviate the troubles of this lady. And then when he does this dua, he sends 200 dirhams with one of his servants. He says, go and make sure that she is taken care of. When he gets there, the servant, he gets there, he notices that that lady has been freed from the clutches of the enemy at that moment. He says, what just happened? She said, I don't know. But as soon, for some reason, they were taking me away and they stopped right away. The servant said, Imam As-Sadiq was praying for you in Masjid As-Sahla, and he has sent these 200 dirham for you. He said, why? She said, why? He said, the Imam alayhi salam heard that when you fell and you broke your rib, you called out and you remembered Fatima az-Zahra. At that point in time, she began crying and she said, take this 200 dirhams and give it back to the Imam. I did not do this for any income or any money. When this news reached the Imam said that name Fatima al-Zahra is so dear to us. He gave 70 dirham on top of that. He said, give it to her. Once we, Ahlul Bayt, give, we don't take it back. This was the musibah of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. We're told there's a moment in time when Mansur al-Dawaniqi, he sends the poison to Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. When he sends the poison to Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, we're told that the blood and the poison begin to become infused. When the blood and the poison begin to become infused, at that point in time the Imam, his holy soul departs. They say that Imam Musa al-Kadhim was 20 years old when Imam Sadiq was martyred. This is the last janazah that is in the city of Medina from the Ahlul Bayt. They say the Imam was 20 and he is the one who helped to bury his father. But I remember one other moment. What was that moment? It was in Karbala on the day of Ashura, but the tables had been turned. The son was roughly 20 years old and the father is the one who was burying him. It was Hussein and Ali Akbar. This was the musibah of the Ahlul Bayt, but the musibah didn't end there. Ajrukum ala Allah. We're told there's a moment that during the life of Imam Sadiq, at least 2 times his home was burned by the enemies. When the home was burned by the enemies, the family got out of the house. When the family got out of the house, Imam Sadiq alayhi salam was looking towards the house. When he was looking towards the house, everyone came outside. He began to cry. They said, Ya Ibna Rasulillah, everyone has come out of the house. Why are you crying? For the property? You're not people of this dunya. He says, no, I'm remembering the day of Ashura. My mothers, my aunts, they were running from tent to tent and they were burning the tents and there was no place for them to be. Ajrukum ala Allah, आखिरी जुमले आजादारो. इमाम को ये भी मरहला याद आया, मगर मैं हाथ जोड़ के एक जुमला कहूंगा, ऐ अबना रसूलिल्लाह, ऐ इमाम सादिक, ये भी एक मंजर था, मगर इमाम हसन से पूछिए वो क्या मंजर था जब बीबी सैयदा के दरवाजे पर आग लाई गई और बीबी के रुखसार पर तमाचा लगा। इमाम हसन देख रहे थे और घर जल रहा था। ألا لعنة الله على القوم الظالمين وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون. Ya Allah, we ask you to bless this holy gathering. Ya Allah, account this in the account of ibadah on our behalf. Ya Allah, allow us to understand the deficiencies in our modern education system. Ya Allah, allow us to learn from the University of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. Allow us to follow in his path. Allow us to understand true knowledge in its true sense, the way the Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam wanted us to. Ya Allah, allow us to learn from the example of the Ahlul Bayt, to allow us to have the harmonious families, harmonious communities, and harmonious globe with all relations, with people throughout all spectrums, the way that Imam Sadiq alayhi salam had, the way he answered questions and dealt with people who were Shia, non-Shia, people who were non-Muslims even. Ya Allah, allow us to have this ability. Ya Allah, anyone who's suffering from COVID or any illness, Ya Allah, grant them shifa in this night. Ya Allah, anyone who has a financial difficulty, grant them alleviation from their financial difficulty by Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. Anyone who is having exams or is preparing for exams, Ya Allah, grant them success by Imam Jafar Sadiq alayhi salatu wassalam. And Ya Allah, hasten the reappearance of Imam Sahib al-Asri wa Zaman and allow us to be amongst his companions when he returns. If you could please recite a Fatiha for Marhuma Varsi and for all Marhumin al-Mu'minat. Al-Fatiha. Bismillah. معتم حسين يا حسين يا حسين يا حسين.
Ya Hussein.
Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Jafar Sadiq, جعفر صادق، جعفر صادق، جعفر صادق، بابا تمہارے باقر، مادر ہے فروا، رحمت میں سب سے کثرت، سرکار میں ہو اعلیٰ، تم شام کی سیاہی کو پیرہن بنا کر، ہر رات مفلسوں کو ہاتھوں سے ہے کھلایا، جعفر صادق، جعفر صادق، جعفر صادق، جعفر صادق، تمہاری اور نبی کی ایک روز ہے ولادت، اور راہ عدل و حق میں تھی آپ کی شہادت، احمد کی روح تیری روح سے جڑی ہوئی ہے، سارے ملک پہ واجب ہے آپ کی اطاعت، جعفر صادق، جعفر صادق، جعفر صادق، جعفر صادق، گودی ہے جن کی خالی، اولاد انہیں عطا کر، مقروض مومنوں کا جو قرض ہو ادا کر، ہے بے خطا جو قیدی، دے دے انہیں بشارت، کرتے ہیں ہم توسل ہاتھوں کو اب اٹھا کر، جعفر صادق، جعفر صادق، جعفر صادق، جعفر صادق، بے چین یہ جگر ہے ہم تم سے جو جدا ہے، یثرب کو تم بلا لو، لب پہ یہی دعا ہے، آ کے کرے زیارت اور اشک ہم بہائیں، تیرے لیے اے مولا یہ دل تڑپ رہا ہے، جعفر صادق، جعفر صادق، جعفر صادق، جعفر صادق، تم کو ستا رہا تھا عاشور کا وہ منظر، ایک بہن نے جو دیکھا ایک بھائی زیر خنجر، پیارا سا اس کا چہرہ دیکھا تھا خون میں تر، رو کر وہ گر پڑی جب تن سے جدا ہوا سر، جعفر صادق، جعفر صادق، جعفر صادق، جعفر صادق، انگور کا گہل جب منصور تم کو بھیجا، تب سخت زہر اس نے انگور میں تھا ڈالا کھا کر لرز رہا تھا مولا بدن تمہارا گریا کیا اٹھا کر کاظم تمہارا لاشا جعفر صادق جعفر صادق جعفر صادق جعفر صادق سورۃ مبارکۃ الفاتحہ.
بسم اللہ الرحمن الرحیم. السلام علیکہ یا رسول اللہ، السلام علیکہ یا امیر المؤمنین، السلام علیکہ یا فاطمۃ الزہرا، السلام علیکہ یا خدیجۃ الکبریٰ، السلام علیکہ یا حسن المجتبیٰ، السلام علیکہ یا ابا عبداللہ الحسین وعلی الارواح التي هلت بفنائك. عليك مني سلام الله أبدا ما بكيت وبكى الليل والنهار والله يجعله الله آخر العهد مني زيارتكم. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين وعلى تسعة المعصومين من ذريتك علي بن الحسين ومحمد بن علي وجعفر بن محمد وموسى بن جعفر وعلي بن موسى ومحمد بن علي وعلي بن محمد والحسن بن علي والحجة بن حسن أجل الله فرجه سهل الله مخرجه وظهوره. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم كل وليك الحجة بن الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة ليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا حتى تسكنه أرزك توا وتمتعه فيها طويلا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين.